Leonid, who can't be with us today, is a professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations and also a professor at the Institute of Asian and African Countries from Moscow State University. Tom Boyd is going to read his paper for us. Thank you, Tom.
I apologize for reading a paper by a Russian in a Texas accent. I do hope you're able to comprehend it. This is a paper dealing with globalization and the demand of democratic trends into the future and how Gülen addresses that problem. So it moves fairly precipitously toward that issue. It sets up by talking about globalization in general and then moves into the problematic that presents, not only in general, but particularly for Islam, how Islam is both responding to it and places where it has failed to respond to it. And then offering an alternative to that the author believes Gülen had established very well. So I'm going to do a combination of reporting what he is saying and reading passages. That's the way I've elected to do it because I've had exactly an hour and a half to prepare. The world scene is dominated by two things: globalization and our fear of terrorism. Therefore, at the center of our life lies the profound need for political reform. Islam as a theoretical phenomenon, that is, in its theoretical life, does offer some principles for participating in that future. However, he believes that Islam has often not fulfilled that pledge in the way it is now challenged to do so. Globalization, says Gülen, according to him, is natural. It is a phenomenon that is as inevitable as any we could imagine. Further, it has had a profound effect on everyone, including Islam itself and the Muslim people around the world. The West, in this process, has had a clear and distinct advantage, and that advantage is largely economical. We have been often, and since you're sitting at one of the citadels of the West today, we know this. We're not only advantaged, we're very proud of it. And he didn't say that. And we often presume upon it. What he says is that it may be helpful, says Gülen, if we look at Sharia law in light of this situation. And by looking at Sharia law, we may discover some way of giving a contribution to the process through Islam. There is a different view from Islam than the popular view in the public today. We have to reinterpret our own values as Muslims, and we have to make those relevant to today, but at the same time, they stand in their own right. It's complicated because of one thing. When it comes to democratization, which is one of the foci here, when it comes to democratization, there is a tendency of the highly democratic countries in the world to impose their democracy. And of course, I have argued that vehemently for a long time. In fact, this whole paper excited me because he's very, very smart. He agrees with me. And Gülen starts with the proposition, you cannot use coercion in matters of religion. And he says, I add also that we should not use coercion in matters of politics. That is not the way a democracy properly works. And I think that's an interesting point at which he believes, as a Muslim, that we can begin to talk to each other. Nevertheless, in this situation, where there are great differences, Islam has benefited economically in some quarters more than in others, but it has benefited. Yet, cultural and moral and religious values resist coercion and are not being properly attended because they are not themselves a part of the coercive activity. I think that's an important insight. That was helpful to me. The basic values of our common humanity as people all over the world must be considered. And therefore, the issues of religion cannot be avoided. Islamic Sharia may provide guidance and understanding in such a process, and we have to attend that possibility. There are motives that we believe we have, that if they're properly stated and properly followed ourselves, I'm speaking now as a Muslim, which I am sometimes. He quotes the fiqh, is that how you say that, fiqh? F-I-Q-H? Yes, okay. I just learned that word last Friday, so I'm still working on it. And it quotes it, in matters are always to be judged by motives. And I think that might include agency, if I'm correct in understanding him. Here is a piece from the Quran. Help you one another in righteousness and piety, but help you not one another in sin and rancor. Listen to that. Right path between prohibition and permission has always been an interest of Islam, and we seek to follow that path. Between the potential conflicts between Islam and globalization, the task is to find that balance. But today, there's an added dimension, and that dimension is urgency. Urgency means that we can no longer go off into our exclusive camps without regard to our common task because of the provenance of globalization. Now, there are some things Sharia does not ban outright. There are things that are possibly permissible. In other words, you have to negotiate them in Sharia, he argues. And he says, the presumption of permissibility of using everything that is not banned by the Quran or the Prophet's Sunnah can be applied. In other words, in the guidance of Sharia, there is wiggle room. And he believes it should have that wiggle room. Not everything is established rigidly by law. I'm going to throw this in. It's just an aside, but it won't cost you anything. The Pharisees in ancient Judaism believed that you had to follow rigidly the law, and the law was explicit about everything, but they discovered it wasn't explicit about everything. Therefore, on occasion, you will run into something for which there is no law. Do what you will. Now, isn't that clever? But in Islamic law, or in Islamic Sharia, there is this wiggle room, and he says, in Islam, we must pay attention to that. Therefore, we have to be ready to face what he calls the presumption of permissibility as a factor, and he quotes Gülen as saying that. And this kind of guidance, where do we find it? Where is the arena, as we just heard in the previous paper, where is the arena for agency to play into it, and therefore not simply guided by rules that have no variance in them? He says this is the place that Islam has got to study itself and work. What we seek in that process is balance. Balance between what damages and what benefits people. To do this, we must return, the author says, to basic principles. Globalization needs cross-cultural value dialogue to do that. In other words, to get to our basic principles as Muslims, we must return to the idea of the cross-cultural values that we share. But how will we know that? We know that by dialogue. Now, that's already an introduction to Gülen himself. Now, here's what he said we must do, first of all, and I see the Gülen movement having taken this on dramatically, and that is we have to introduce Islam to the West. I think that's the reason I said last night I've been in a steep learning curve, because my abysmal ignorance of Islam was threatening me, and I didn't know exactly why, but part of it, this paper says, is globalization. It's a part of my world. It's not a world over there, out there, somewhere else. It's here. Therefore, he turns to Gülen's contribution to this process. Now, he speaks of how Gülen, for example, first of all, recognizes that modern mankind differs deeply from the human society of previous centuries. And he talks here about the importance and centrality of change in our time, the dramatic reach of change, and the threat of change in many ways, because in the midst of that, we are more and more interdependent. Change, interdependence. How do those two work together? The problem is here, according to this author. The scientific capacity and its uses are everywhere. The question is never the science itself, but to what ends and what purposes will it be employed? And I found this to be so resonant with thinking I've been doing for the last decade. It is not science and technology that is the enemy. It is the human wisdom, I'm quoting Isaac Asimov, the human wisdom to employ that understanding toward human ends. And that's where he calls on Gülen's voice. And he says, Fethullah Gülen, more than anyone else today in Islam, is saying, we must ask serious questions about science, not about its own capacities, but about our capacities to deploy it in ways that will work. Oh, come on. Okay. We need to correlate science with human values. And those values will either serve us and our fulfillment as global citizens, or they will fail us. Will it be good intentions? Will it be malice? Will it be exploitation? Will it be understanding? He goes through a litany of these things. Then moral and religious values, he believes, have been eroded. Here is a quote from Gülen. The world is going through a spiritual crisis. All the essential supporting pillars of humanity have collapsed and have been destroyed. Now that is a strong statement. And it's a powerful statement that should throttle us a bit in our own presumption of our time. But at the same time, he believes there are things that can be done. There are great cultural differences and they will continue. Therefore, the first order of business, respect for diversity and pluralism. He says pluralism is a natural fact. I'm not sure what he means by that, but he says it. That pluralism is a natural fact, that we are going to be pluralists because pluralism is built in. Therefore, and you can hear Gülen's voice here, tolerance is the departure point. Tolerance is where we must begin. And to be tolerant, we must possess knowledge. Right here, more than anything else, although the author does not mention education at all, I hear resonating in my own mind Gülen's constant reference to education as the necessary means to it. And that helps us to develop, he says, a new way of thinking. Here's where he says classical religion comes into play. The wisdom of the past must inform our present. This is a fascinating point for me because yesterday he was talked about as a kind of traditionalist. Well, he is in a way. But when I read Gülen, what I read is this, he wants to reach back for the maximum continuities in the qualities of human wisdom, ensconced in this case in Islam, but at the same time, he is a very contemporary man. He is living in this world. He is not unaware of globalization. He embraces it because he calls it a natural fact, and if it is, what do? Tolerance begins it, dialogue continues it, and in that process, Islam, and I'm getting to the speech now, Islam must reform itself. In fact, I see Fethullah Gülen in the qualitative sense of a reformer. Let me read a statement or two. In other words, Islam did not supply the Muslim public with a position that would fit Islamic principles. We couldn't help feel that at ideological levels, Islam had so far been unable to meet the challenges of our time. No wonder, in the absence of a clear Islamic strategy, most contemporary authors remain reserved or even pessimistic about the future of Islamic civilization. Those who would like to detach it from the other world come up with a much clearer message. In other words, you're open to addressing it. And I am out of time. I'm going to quit.